Okay, so this morning we'll go a little bit over simultaneous biliteracy through paired literacy texts, and then a couple of strategies, preview, view, review, that you may be familiar with, often used in the context of your content instruction, maybe science, maybe math, and today we're going to explore it in the context of literacy and cross-language connections, because we know how important those are for the development of biliteracy. So hopefully by the end of the session, you should be able to understand a little bit more about translanguaging and some strategies that support it. So what is bilingual education? I always say bilingual education. I like this picture here that I've chosen because it's complicated. It's not easy. And Baker tells us that bilingual education is a simple label for a complex phenomenon. If it was really easy, we would have figured it out, right? And we continue to evolve, we continue to tweak, because it is a very complex phenomenon. And we cannot dilute the conversations about bilingual education into short, quick fixes, because we know how complicated it is. We know that in the United States, 62 million people speak a language other than English, and that was back in 2013. 1 in 5 students in the US speaks a language other than English. Now, I think recent figures show that as 1 in 4 students in the US speaks a language other than English, and 77% speak Spanish, out of which about 44% are born in the United States. And so that has implications in terms of how we support our learners, whether they're simultaneous bilinguals or whether they're sequential bilinguals. And later on, we'll talk a little bit more about that. In the fall of 2017, there were 51 million students in public schools. 11% of all students in the US are classified as English learners. And we know that Arabic, Chinese, and Vietnamese were the most common home languages. Is that something similar here in Chicago? These are the next languages? Yeah. And so I'll frame this through the 3 pillars of dual language education. I draw a lot of my work from the work of Ofelia Garcia, Dr. Ofelia Garcia from City University of New York, Beeman, the Freemans, Mercury, but I also look at the Center for Applied Linguistics and the recommendations that they give us from the guiding principles. When we look at it, there's 3 goals. Let me see if I can turn this on. There are 3 goals right here: academic achievement, biliteracy, and biculturalism. Ofelia Garcia, if you look at the top where I put DLBE, encourage us to continue to put the B into dual language bilingual education. She says there's been a silencing of the word bilingual. Have you ever experienced where perhaps someone wants their children in dual language but not in bilingual? And dual language is a bilingual education program. So we want to make sure that we honor the intent of those programs. And the 3 goals: academic achievement, biliteracy, and biculturalism. I think we talk a lot about academic achievement and biliteracy. We don't talk enough about biculturalism. And so keep on thinking about that, because that's a big piece into the program. Not what our content is today, but a piece that without it is not going to be as powerful as it should be. So some key understandings when we talk about bilingual education dual language programs is, who are the learners in our dual language programs? Without really knowing the learner and who is it that we're servicing, and how a learner in a dual language bilingual program may be different from a monolingual learner in a different program. So we need to start by knowing who the learner is. And what are the learner's linguistic configuration? How I came about being bilingual is different than how you came about being bilingual, how you came, Adriana, about being bilingual, right? Because we develop our bilingualism in different contexts. Well, our students are the same. Their linguistic configurations from one student to the next is going to be different. So we need to keep all of that in mind as we try to really best service the students in our dual language programs. And so how do we best support the complex learning practices of our bilingual learners? Because this is what it is. It's very complex and they're unique. They're very unique learning needs. So let's just look at this picture right here about the emergent bilingual. And you know that the field is moving a little bit more and more towards the word emergent bilingual in an attempt to move us away from English language learner and just defining our students as just English language learners. This is a more positive way to embrace that idea that bilingualism is dynamic and ongoing, and we continue to develop it through a lifetime. I still consider myself an emergent bilingual because we're always acquiring new terms, new language, and that can happen whether you're a bilingual or a monolingual. You continue to grow linguistically, correct? And so the new terminology that we use now is emergent bilingual. So let's look at this little girl here. And she says, I speak mostly Spanish with my mom and dad, but I speak English with my siblings. I learn English and Spanish at school. What program might service her? She may be in what form of bilingual education program? She speaks Spanish with her mom and dad, but I speak English with my siblings. I learn English and Spanish at school. She could be in a transitional bilingual program. What else? Could she be in a dual language program? She could be in a one-way. She could be in a two-way dual language program. She could be in a late exit maintenance program. She can be serviced in many ways. And she's an emergent bilingual, correct? So now let's look at this little boy here. I speak Arabic at home. Sometimes I use Arabic at school. I learn English at school. Where is he served?
Could be in a TPI program or in a dual language. Because if he's learning English at school.
But only English at school. Maybe a transitional, maybe an ESL late maintenance, sort of maybe integrated, could be pull out, could be many things, right? But what I want to illustrate with him is that he's also an emergent bilingual. So for that teacher of this student in an all English context to best serve him, she needs to see him as an emergent bilingual and not a monolingual. He's in a monolingual program, but the child is an emergent bilingual. And that has implications on how we can leverage instruction to best meet his needs. What about him here, if he was in that scenario? I speak Arabic and English at home and learn Spanish at school. That should say Spanish and English at school, right? In a dual language program,
yeah.
Right? Because he speaks Arabic and English, so he's already bilingual of Arabic and English, and now he's adding a third language at school, which we have a lot of students like that. Do you have a lot of students like that in your dual language programs, whose Spanish is maybe their third language? And so we'll talk a little bit now about bilinguals, bilingualism, biliteracy, and translanguaging. There has been some changes in our views of bilinguals and bilingualism, on how we understand them in terms of being emergent and sometimes experienced bilinguals. Because you get a student into a classroom who's an emergent bilingual, but you have others who are more experienced bilinguals, who have their two languages more fully developed than the emergent bilingual. And the views are the balanced view and the holistic view. So let's explore those two. The 20th century view was that the goal was to produce two perfect monolinguals, that you would be a monolingual of Spanish and a monolingual of English, that you could function to produce balanced bilinguals who are equally proficient in two separate languages. Students in many dual language programs were taught like they were monolinguals as they were instructed in each language. Have you experienced that a little bit? Talk to me about that. What would be something you have experienced like that?
Our state laws require us to do that.
Exactly, right? And sometimes when we're assessed, We want to assess the students to get to a level of proficiency that's like an English speaker or a level or higher level of proficiency, right? Two separate monolinguals in one. So are we perfect? Like, I know for me, sometimes I'm more proficient in one language than I am in the other, depending on the context. Does that happen to you? The context changes our level of proficiency. So this idea that we can be equally proficient in both languages was the view that we've been working under, and that was called the balanced view of bilingualism. More and more, we're moving towards the holistic view of bilingualism. And the work of Dr. Garcia and so many others see bilingualism as dynamic. Our languages continuing and evolving with each other. So the bilinguals are not simply the sum of two monolinguals. I always say when I walked into here today, I did not leave my Spanish-speaking self outside of that door, and neither did you. We came in as an integrated bilingual whole, right? And at this moment, you're hearing features of part of my linguistic repertoire that we called English. But my linguistic repertoire is English and Spanish. For some of you who speak a third or a fourth language, it would be composed of all of those languages, correct? And so an integrated whole who cannot easily be decomposed into two separate parts, who has a unique and specific linguistic configuration. This view goes one step beyond, that we have one language system with features that are continuous and features that are socially constructed as English and then Spanish. So here is a little bit of drawing from the work of Kathy Escamilla, a little bit of this definition of simultaneous and sequential bilinguals, okay? So let's look at it. Simultaneous are those students exposed to two languages, and be thinking of your learners, the learners in your classroom, exposed to two languages between ages 0 and 5. Do you have students like that? May not have a clearly dominant language, whereas in the sequential, they're exposed to the second language after age 5. And in your dual language programs, you probably have students who are simultaneous and sequential, correct? Mm-hmm. Talk about that. What are who are your simultaneous in the program and who might be your sequentials in the program?
So the simultaneous could be the students that have Spanish-speaking parents but pick up the English with their siblings, TV, or anything else that they're exposed to.
They have been exposed to both languages since age 0 and 5, correct? And then our sequentials,
or knowing the mother language.
their dominant language, maybe Chinese, maybe English, and then they're coming to school after age 5 to learn a second language. So knowing that when you sit at a table with your students to do a guided reading lesson, that some are simultaneous and some are sequential, have a little bit of implications. It's just something that we have to be aware of. I go back to the beginning when I talked about knowing our students and their linguistic configurations to better service them. And so in this case right here, may not have a clearly dominant language and has a clear L1. I'm going to connect this one here with this one here. It's often labeled as a child with low levels of language proficiency in two languages. I think that's a result of monolingual assessments, right? Because they are developing both languages simultaneously, but when you are assessing them separately, it's going to look like especially at the very early stages, like they're low in both languages, when in reality, we know that they're not. It says here, but if we assess bilingually, we would understand that he may know some concepts in one language and others in the other language. In this case, clearly knows concepts only in the L1, is labeled as Spanish or English dominant or Korean or whatever their dominant language may be. But in both cases, whether it's a simultaneous or sequential, they have the language skills in 2 languages that can be used to develop biliteracy. So translanguaging, how many of you have had a little bit of experience with this concept of translanguaging through professional development and conversations? Okay. So translanguaging comes from the Welsh, Trasuth, I think is how it may be pronounced, and it was coined by a Welsh educator, Ken Williams. I think it was back in 1994, I believe, something like that, in which he developed a pedagogy for his students for the purpose of receptive and productive use and to deepen and extend their bilingualism. For example, he may read a book in English, read aloud a book in English, and the students would respond in their dominant language, in the other language. That was kind of like the early beginnings of translanguaging. In the United States, translanguaging has been popularized by Dr. Ofelia Garcia. So now I'm just going to do about a 2-minute little video clip of her talking a little bit to us about translanguaging.
Hi, my name is Ofelia Garcia. I'm a professor of urban education here at the Graduate Center. And today I've been asked to discuss translanguaging. And I've been asked to discuss what it is and who can do it. So let's start with the first question. What is translanguaging? So translanguaging is the use of the children's full linguistic repertoire to make meaning without thinking of the fact that they have one language that is different from the other. So bilingual children have one language system with linguistic features that of course are associated with one language or the other, but they also learn to suppress certain features depending on the communicative situation in which they're at. Translanguaging is also a way of teaching, a pedagogy that builds on those fluid language practices that bilingual children have, a pedagogy that allows children, for example, to read in one language and then discuss in another, or to read in one language and write in another. So a way of using all the linguistic resources in order to make meaning. One question that we're often asked here at CUNY NYSIB is whether translanguaging means the same thing as code switching. And of course, code switching and translanguaging are epistemologically different. The idea being that when you code switch, you are really going from one named language, one national language, to another. And it is an external viewpoint. It's a viewpoint of nation states, of schools. It's looking in. Whereas translanguaging has a very different meaning because translanguaging is an internal viewpoint. What is it psychologically that bilinguals have? What is their mental grammar like? And the mental grammar, of course, is constructed through social interaction. But indeed, what bilinguals have is one language system with features that, of course, correspond to one language or the other. So epistemologically, they're very different concepts because the code switching is external. It's an external viewpoint of languages. Translanguaging is internal. Translanguaging has to do with what the child has. The resources, the communicative resources that children have to make meaning, to learn, and that teach.
So let's discuss that a little bit. What are your understandings of translanguaging based on that or based on what you already know about translanguaging?
Sort of using what a child already knows to make sense of the language or what he's understanding.
Good, make meaning. At the end of the day, making meaning. What else?
And she explained it, she explained it in the sense that code switching is not the same as translanguaging. So code switching is something external and translanguaging is something internal. When you were talking about the simultaneous and the sequential learner, the simultaneous one is already exposed to two languages, and that's the language that they use. They form one, well, it's not because she explained it differently. The language that they have, it is mostly what they have learned based on the community where they live and how it is the child being brought up. And not necessarily what happens in New York may happen in California or another state. What happens is that this child, or the language that these children have, is unique to them. And the translanguaging part, when it comes from the children, it is their understanding of the world, or what is happening based on their background experiences, where they live.
And how they make meaning, how they construct understanding, right? Because at the end of the day, central to everything that we do is meaning making. Making the children have those those understanding, right? And their language, their linguistic repertoire is a resource that they bring into the classroom to make meaning. You could look at language in three ways. Language can be seen as a problem, language can be seen as a right, and language can be seen as a resource. In dual language programs, we do see language, the view that guides our programs is that language is the right to use, and that is also a resource for learning. That using their dominant language is not a problem for learning, right? And so sometimes when we're in classrooms that work under strict separation of languages, let's say this is English time and this is Spanish time and this is science or this is math, even when you're in that space of just English, science, or Spanish, social studies, whatever it may be, if you listen closely, what you're going to hear in the classroom is the current of translanguaging. Ofelia Garcia says, in a classroom, there's always that current, right? So it may be that it's all English, but you hear the kids using both languages to make meaning. They're working on a project. They're not all just in the language of that content, but very naturally they do that because they have this full linguistic repertoire that they use to make meaning, okay? And so what she says is an approach to bilinguals centered not on the language, but on the practices of bilinguals. It focuses on what the speakers do. They use the children's full linguistic repertoire, but it's also a pedagogy that we can use to allow children to use their full linguistic repertoire to make meaning. In this diagram here about a linguistic repertoire, you see the full linguistic repertoire illustrated here, and then there are features of Spanish and features of English. In the linguistic repertoire, what do we have as bilinguals? Linguistic features, phonemes, morphemes, syntactic rules, discourse rules that people draw on to communicate. Bilinguals and multilinguals have linguistic repertoires from features that are used in one or more than one language. This one's kind of the same here, right? So when you hear me now as a bilingual, the sociocultural reality is that you're hearing this or that, si comienzo ahora a hablar en español. And sometimes, as we translanguage, there is a little bit of even a hybrid space between the two right here that you would hear. That is the sociocultural reality, but the linguistic reality is that bilingual have one linguistic system with features of both the languages here. That's that internal view. And then the external view is where you select features of those languages to communicate, to make meaning, to enhance comprehension, and so on and so forth. Ofelia Garcia gives the example of a little boy that once told her about, he said something to the fact that Spanish runs through my heart, but English runs through my veins. right? When I heard her say that, I said, I feel like that, right? Because it's so connected. You don't separate one from the other, but both named languages become your language system. And so what is a translanguaging classroom? A translanguaging classroom is a classroom where teachers like you allow the students to deploy their full linguistic repertoires and not just the particular language that are officially used for instructional purpose. You can only use English or you can only use Spanish, but you allow some of these translanguaging practices. Additionally, in these classrooms, teachers intentionally engage students in doing cross-language connections, right? And a lot of you are doing that kind of work in terms of those cross-language connections, which is so critical to develop biliteracy for our students. So at the end of the day, what is translanguaging pedagogy? The pedagogy itself, our teaching practice, is culturally responsive. Dual language programs are culturally responsive. It helps us to develop simultaneous biliteracy. It helps to increase comprehension of texts and concepts learned in the target language. And it helps to extend and support the students' linguistic repertoire. So these are the purposes for translanguaging pedagogy. So here's the caveat for you. This is not to say that we eliminate those spaces that are designed for English and Spanish that are so needed in our dual language programs. That's why our dual language programs are called dual language immersions, because you have to have a space where kids can be immersed in extended language use of that language. But that we are a little bit more flexible and that we move from those rigid, very rigid spaces, okay? Again, here you'll see that in our dual language programs, we're going to have those macro spaces of English and Spanish, right? We all have them. Whatever your program design, a day and a day, a 50-50, an 80-20, you have spaces for Spanish instruction and you have spaces for English instruction. We're not moving away from that. What we're saying is that through those big macro spaces, there could be opportunities for translanguaging, okay? Because at the end of the day, we want to be able to achieve those purposes established here, to develop simultaneous biliteracy, to increase comprehension and allow students to work through all of their linguistic repertoire to make meaning, as well as extend both their languages simultaneously. So translanguaging in the classroom as pedagogy is strategic, is planned, and is intentional, okay? This is really, really important. If you have to write anything today, write that. Because it's not random, right? And it's not code switching, and it's not free for all, correct? Because sometimes that's the fear. If we open that door, then we're going to move away from the big macro spaces that we must have in an immersion program. But not if you do it in a strategic, planned, and intentional way. It has to have a purpose. What is not is concurrent translation. That's what it's not. It's strategic, it's planned, it's intentional, but it's not concurrent translation. So now we'll talk a little bit about this idea of paired literacy instruction. It challenges the view that teaching children to read in both languages simultaneously is going to confuse the children. Remember, most of our ELLs in our dual language programs are already simultaneous bilinguals. So we need to leverage the resources that they bring into classroom and align our practices to that learner. It provides teachers and students with opportunities for biliteracy to develop through, once again, is that word here, intentional planning. And hybrid spaces where languages are strategically used. So again, it's strategic, it's planned, it's intentional, and you do it in order to continue to help the children to develop simultaneously and get to that biliteracy. Even within whatever your program design may be, you think about how can some of these practices still fit within my program model. It capitalizes on students' strengths in both their languages. English literacy instruction is not delayed while the children are learning to read and write in Spanish. We do not cease Spanish literacy instruction once the children have reached a certain level of Spanish reading. You want to continue both, because if you cease the Spanish instruction at third or fourth, you're not a dual language program. That just became more of a late exit or early exit model where you are transitioning and replacing one language with the other. In a dual language program, we want to continue building both languages together. Intentionally and purposefully connects English and Spanish literacy environments. Preview view review. How many of you are familiar with preview view review? Anyone? You are? In what context?
In the content area.
In the content areas?
Yeah, for newer.
Sometimes for newcomers, for newer students? Okay. So preview view review, she's right, it's a technique in which the teacher takes a few minutes prior to teaching a lesson and a few minutes following the lesson to have a brief discussion with the students to activate prior knowledge and to summarize key concepts for the topic to be taught or read. Once again, remember that slide on the caveat that we still have to have those big macro spaces? That's restated here. The majority of the instructional time is still in the target language, but you build a space for preview and review in the student's dominant language. And I'll show you some examples of that in a few minutes. So a few minutes in dominant language at the beginning and at the end of the lesson have been shown to increase student learning by allowing students to activate schema and solidify essential concepts. That is one big reason why we do it, because we have to activate schema. And we also have to provide students with some background knowledge to get into the content that we're going to work on. Preview view review allows students to use their full, complete linguistic repertoire. In each part of the structure, the teacher adheres to the main language of the part of the structure. So if you're doing preview view review and the target language is, let's say, English, that's the view, that's the target language. The preview is in Spanish and the review is in Spanish, right? But you, the teacher, during that structure, you're the model of Spanish, then the model of English, then the model of Spanish. You stay in the language of the structure. Now, the students that are at the very early stages, they can use their entire linguistic repertoire as they're communicating with you in that specific part of the structure. But as they get to more advanced levels of language proficiency, you would expect them to perform in the language of the structure that you're performing on. Does that make sense? Okay, I'll show you an example. Again, if the target language is Spanish, the preview and the review is in English. Red to illustrate Spanish, blue to illustrate English. If the target language is English, then the preview and review is in Spanish, okay? So here's an example with a couple of texts. I've chosen these texts because they have a theme that goes across both books. But you could do the same if you had a text, let's say, on a different text that you wanted to use to preview on adaptations. Okay? In this case, when you do a preview view review, the teacher first plans for the view. You plan for the lesson that you're going to do in guided reading for those learners. That's where you start, like you always do, correct? You start with the view, and then for the lesson delivery, you deliver preview, view, and review. But in the planning, we start with the view. We start with this piece here, your guided reading lesson. Okay, so today we're talking about preview, view, review in the context of your guided reading, small group reading instructional lesson. So what kinds of things can we do in a preview? If I had chosen this book as my, they're both in Spanish. If I had chosen the little book in English as my target language, my view. In the preview, using this book in Spanish for a few minutes prior to the lesson, I could do a read aloud of sections of this book. I could go to a specific chapter and discuss that piece with the students in their native language. We could do a picture walk. We could look at text features. We could look at pictures. We can discuss it because I know that in this case, this book is related to the other book in terms of the concept of adaptations. And I'm using this one for what? To build schema, background. And how long did it take? Right? You know your purpose. You're going to do it for a few minutes to build background into the other language. So here's some of the kids that might be in more advanced levels of Spanish language proficiency. You may not have to do it at the guided reading table. You may be able to give this book to the learners and they can go to a center and preview it there. The students could go with a buddy and read it together. You could preview it in science or social studies, correct? So many ways to use the L1 to build background to get into the second language. The view becomes your guided reading lesson. Do y'all do guided reading, small group instruction? Okay, in your small group instruction for guided reading, you do your before, your during, your after. What else would you do here, generally, when you teach in small group readings or even small group science, when you're teaching the lesson? If you were applying this strategy, Adriana, and some of you who teach at the middle school, this strategy through the content, your view part of it, because it's in the second language for many of the students in the room, is sheltered, right? That one has to be linguistically supported as well. But you, in this case, you would do your before, your during, and your after, your word study, your writing, all the pieces that you would do during your balanced literacy lesson in that other target language. When you go to the review, remember how I show you the three? When you go to the review, it has two purposes. The first purpose is to clarify misconceptions. Now, we previewed in Spanish. The majority of the lesson was in what language? In English. But then that little translanguaging space allows us to come back and do a small review, right? And in that review, we would clarify for misconceptions. We want to know that maybe in spite of the language, that the students understood the concept. In this case, it's adaptations. And have a little bit of that conversation. You could even say to the students, what did you learn about salamanders? ¿Qué aprendimos acerca de las salamandras después de haber leído estos dos libros? Very quickly, very short. But it's a little bit of your formative assessment in the students' dominant language. The next part of the review, in that space, you could do a little bit of cross-language connections. You could do it as that part of the review. It depends on your program and your program design, or you could do it in that space in your program that's already designed for you to build cross-language connections, right? Because many of you say you're already doing that. So you have a space where you're doing cross-language connections. And here I put some examples that draw from the work of Beeman and Euro. I think sometimes we do a lot of cross-language connections at the morphology cognate level. So important, right? That's like our number one, and we do it a lot because it has high leverage in terms of kids making meaning and students also developing biliteracy. But we cannot forget that there are other connections that we can make with students at the phonology level, right? The sound systems. Like in this case, the sound symbol correspondence, the k sound, como en que, queso, or casa in Spanish, and the k or k in English. Silent letters, the H and the U in Spanish, many in English, and there's so many silent letters in English as well, like in ghost. Similar sounds, the TH, I still have trouble with the ED endings for me. And I continue to be an emerging bilingual, and that TH and that ED, so there's some intentionality that has to happen for the students to be able to hear those distinctions. And the morphology, prefixes, suffixes, syntax and grammar, rules for punctuation, similarities and differences, conjugations of verbs in Spanish reduces the need for the pronoun. Instead, I am going, voy. Those are really powerful instructional points that we can share with our student when we're doing those cross-language connections. Sentence structure, exclamation point, gender, reflexive nouns, noun adjective, word order, and so on and so forth. And also language use. Figurative language is really hard when you're learning in the second language. So we have to kind of look at our text, and when we find figurative language, that is really important for us to talk through that, because it would impact meaning and it impacts comprehension. So while it is important that we do cognates, we have to make sure that we also push ourselves to work at all the other levels where we could be doing linguistic connections for the students. So here's a sample of a lesson with two different texts. The one that I just talked you through, preview in Spanish. The purpose is build background knowledge, develop content-specific vocabulary. Could you do a vocabulary activity in the preview in the first language? Right? And then you kind of put it to the side. And then what are some of the teaching strategies? Looking at text features, maybe a little writing in L1. We could be pointing out some cognates during this little preview space. Then in the view, our lesson is in the second language. It's conducted in the target language. We use sheltered instructional strategies. Some students may have a need for sentence stems and more vocabulary and more scaffolds at the word, at the sentence, and at the paragraph level. We use a different book than the one in the preview. In this case, you do your instructional cycle of before, during, and after. You focus on the concept. Could they work on vocabulary in English now? Could we create some vocabulary cards in the view? They already have some vocabulary, let's say cards, maybe something with a fairy model in the Spanish language. Now in the other language, they're also working on vocabulary. We could be doing some writing in L2. In L1, in the preview, could we do some writing in the preview in L1? And writing in the L2? Would that help develop some simultaneous biliteracy and extend both their languages? And is that concurrent translation? No. What is this? We said three things that I told you to write. If you had to write anything, there were three things. What were they? Strategic, planned, and intentional. And what is not is concurrent translation. Now, during the review, the teacher can bring both texts. The text in English that they did in the view, the text in Spanish that they previewed to build schema, and they can have a conversation. We can synthesize the pair. ¿Qué sabemos acerca de las salamandras después de leer estos dos libros? Can the teacher now write in L2? Can there be another shared writing opportunity for the students? Because one thing that we know is the higher the L1, the higher the L2. So that allows us to continue developing that L1 that is so necessary to continue becoming bilingual and biliterate. Here's a cross-linguistic connection that you could do with side-by-side text. So now this is the same text, but is this concurrent translation? Let's talk about that. Could that be considered concurrent translation? Exactly. Yeah, it would be concurrent translation if we're not doing anything with it, if it's not strategic, planned, and intentional. But in this case, we're using the text side by side, the English and Spanish, to point out to the students something about word order across the two languages. So let's look at this one. What could the students, and I highlighted that, it's not highlighted in the book, but what I would say to the students, what do you notice? What do you notice? Y'all tell me, what do you notice? What would the students say?
Reversed. Salamander roja, or salamandra roja. In English it's red salamander, so it's transposed.
Exactly. In English is adjective noun, and in Spanish is noun adjective, correct? And so this idea of cross-language connection is in both text side by side, helps to contextualize your cross-linguistic connection in relevant text, in real writing. Okay? And I always say real writing because reading is writing. The students need to know that we're reading someone's writing. And I think sometimes kids do not connect with that idea about the connection between reading and writing, and that what reading is a writer's work. And so here's another one. Again, this comes from pages 8 of these two books. And like that, you could find this in many texts that you work with your students, correct? But we have to look at the text from the lens of what opportunities are in this text for me to build some cross-linguistic connections. All texts are not going to have opportunities for word order or adjective noun. You may just choose contractions. You may just choose something else because it's really intentional in that text. In this case here, what do you notice? I put two side by side and I'm using this text in English and Spanish. And what do you notice? And I know it's kind of far for some of you back here, but it's I'd, me encantaría, I'd love to. Es hermoso, he's beautiful. I didn't, lo que le dije que cuando Duque fuera mayor I didn't know, no sabía que tenías un perro. What do you notice about the language used in both? It's contractions? Uh-huh. And it doesn't exist in what language? In Spanish, but it does in English. And then we can also talk about how instead of I'd love to, it says me encantaría. And I is not needed. Is that important for kids to notice in text? And then also to create some of their own very examples. But here they get to see it in relevant text. Okay? So really important that we try to build those with side-by-side text. Here's an example of a teacher that I was working with. And what I liked about this is she always has a question, what do you notice? And then she started using anchor charts as she's developing, going through her text, and she gets to that cross-linguistic connection. She puts the name of both titles here. There's Go in that cave, ahora en esa casa, en esa cueva. And then the English example, adjective noun, noun adjective, sustantivo adjetivo. And then she will continue. So this anchor chart in her classroom is only going to be about adjective, noun, noun adjective. She has others on contractions. But this one she'll later use for the students to make generalizations about what happens every time, okay, through the word order across the two languages. There are times during instruction to keep the two languages separate. We all agree with that. However, there are also times for creating a shared and interdependent space for the promotion of language awareness and cross-languaging processing. Now, you could use the same title. Remember how I just used different titles for the preview review? You could use the same title. I don't prefer that strategy because it could take you into what? Concurrent translation. If you're not what? What are the three things you must be? If you're not strategic and plan and intentional, that can be risky. So if you're working with teachers in planning or leading groups or you're self-planning, it's really important that you say, I can do things with this because I didn't find another title and I really want to build background with it, but I must make sure that it doesn't go into concurrent translation. So where with these books, the child may read it completely if I put it at the center because that wasn't concurrent translation. I would not do a read aloud of this book, right? I would use maybe parts of it, but not the entire book. Does that make sense? In this example, I'm putting Spanish as the target language and English as the dominant language. In the other example, we did English as the target and Spanish as the dominant language. So do you see here for the preview, we could do things like getting ready to read, introduce the book in Spanish. Can I do a picture walk with it? Would that be appropriate? Look at the pictures, do a picture walk. For some of you at the secondary level, can you look at text features in another text in the language? Can you do other activities with it, with something related to your content in the preview? You could highlight vocabulary, you could discuss it, you want to build schema. The view, just like in the other example, each student reads the text independently and the teacher monitors and support. After reading, you're talking about the book, you're writing in the L2, but you also want to make sure when working in the view in the second language, whether it's literacy or whether it's science or mathematics, in your dual language programs, someone is always going to be a second language learner of the other language. And often, your students who are dominant speakers of the language still need that language support because the language of schooling is very different than the Spanish as my dominant language that I may bring into the classroom. And so you want to make sure that you help them with the types of support in case that you want the students to summarize, to infer, to retell, to describe, to explain. They need the language to be able to do that. In the review, what could we do? ¿Qué aprendices acerca de las orugas? We brought the two books together, English and Spanish, pero la pregunta, la conversación es en el dominant language. Actually, that was we would be doing it in the dominant language of English. What did we learn about the caterpillars? And then we can move and support the students into making cross-linguistic connections across the two books. And so some of the things that I shared with you today are a couple of strategies that are grounded on the idea of translanguaging and the children's full linguistic repertoire and how you as a teacher can leverage that to help the students make meaning, develop those languages, keeping in mind your program goals and where these pieces fit into it. But you don't move away from making sure you have your just big spaces of English and Spanish. You're just a little bit more flexible to allow students to simultaneously develop both languages. And so thank you so much. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to discuss them with you. Do you have any questions? How might you use some of these things? What are you thinking? What are the things that you're thinking after? Yes, please.
So my district uses the Calkins.
Lucy Calkins?
Workshop.
Uh-huh.
And I know I'm wondering, you've spoken a lot about how this is great for a small group format.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering how this fits in with Calkins' model of a whole group mini lesson and broken out into small groups after that, or to conferring after that. How do these two things merge?
I think part of it is having these conversations with your leadership at your school, because there has to be a stance that allows for this to happen. You know, we talked about the language as a problem, language as a right, language as a resource. I think, just like my opinion, but it's only my opinion, just like we talked here, there is a space for a small group. You're not using the whole time in the other language. You're just allowing the children to make more meaning, to build schema before you go into your view lesson. So there's a space for it. Translanguaging is already happening in the classroom. Your kids are using both languages all day long, right? That's already happening. So it's how do you leverage? And if not in the language arts, how might you leverage translanguaging in science, in social studies, in mathematics, in all the other content areas that are at that macro level? And a lot of children, especially sometimes for the newcomers, beginner students who are just starting to develop the other language, is necessary. It's like the number one shelter strategy, L1, right? For the ones who are more advanced across both languages and seem more biliterate, this continues to help them to develop both languages simultaneously. So it's different purpose depending on the group of students that we're talking about, okay? So it kind of depends. Remember, I started with knowing our students and their linguistic repertoire. So once you know them, you kind of know what students this may be really essential for in your practice. There's lots of thinking going on. All right, well, if you have any questions, I'm still here. I'm so happy that you came and that you can take one or two things back into your classroom to reflect upon as you continue to refine your instructional practices.